Right. So please. Hi, Daniel.
Hello.
How are you? All good.
Good. Good. Can
Yeah.
you hear me
What
well?
a nice setup that you have. Like, I guess you're like coming straight from a studio itself.
Yes. Well, a studio in my garage, but yes, I actually before doing blockchain security, I did lighting
Mhm,
programming and actually did
mhm,
theatrical lighting as a kid.
mhm.
Um, and
Okay, so we
so
have a garage hacker as well. Okay.
yes, but I don't
Great.
have any like professional lights, so I just got
No,
little
that
lights
is
from the
actually
store and stuck them
looking
behind me.
sick. Yeah, that is actually looking pretty sick. The completely natural background with all the light up and all. Yes, but that was wonderful. So we won't be taking much time, and like a quick introduction from our side. Daniel is the security engineer, senior security engineer at Origin Protocol. He do the security researches. Like we often see him like on a regular basis on Twitter. We follow him, and he constantly posts about the smart contract attacks, like some protocol like getting exploited in a daylight and things like going on, like all the crazy talks. Yes, so with that, I will leave the stage to him, and the stage is all yours, Daniel.
Great. I will start sharing my screen here.
Perfect.
And can you tell me if I'm sharing?
Yes, you.
Okay.
Yes, it's fine. Perfectly visible.
Wonderful. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about understanding hacks. And the first question is why? So if you're here listening, there's probably three reasons. One, you're trying to do bounty hunting, security research, find bugs in other contracts and save them from getting hacked. Two, you might be trying to write contracts and not get hacked, which might even be harder. Or three, you might be trying to hack contracts. And if you're trying to do that, then you're not my friend and I buy you no drinks. But for the first two, securing contracts and helping save other contracts, bounty hunting, the most important thing you can do is understand how contracts get hacked. That's the foundation and the basis for everything you do after that. So there's a lot of things that are easy to find in audits and get found in audits. And that's kind of one class of things, or the audit kind of things. And then there's a second class, which is the things that actually sync contracts. And by following smart contract hacks, you can learn a focused view in exactly the proportions that they happen in the wild of what actually gets contracts wrecked. How does money get stolen? I think it's the best way to learn, other than like a first few minutes of, or, read about these vulnerabilities, know how to write Solidity. But for ongoing education and for turning yourself from a beginner to an expert, nothing really beats reading hacks. And there's kind of two ways to go about it. One way is to read what other people say about it. And the other way is to actually go into the guts yourself, dive in there and find out what really happened. Look at the code yourself. There is no substitute at all for actually looking at the code. Sometimes people make generalizations when they're talking about a contract hack online. Sometimes what is said is not actually true about what the hack was. Sometimes there's more to it than is talked about. So, and possibly the biggest one is you get used to seeing these vulnerabilities inside actual contracts, which when you're trying to secure your own contract, you write some code and then you think, wow, this looks like that hack that happened 6 months ago. And then you look at your code a lot harder then. Or if you're scrolling through something else, it triggers a pattern memory when you've seen this kind of pattern happening before. So looking at smart contract hacks is, I think, the best thing you can do to really go from beginner to an expert on smart contract security. One of the reasons why defending against attackers is so hard in this area and why so much money gets stolen is because attackers have superpowers that bank robbers could only hardly dream of. So if you have this heist movie, They like have to go get the plans to the place they're going to attack, and then they have to go find in a warehouse, and they have to build a replica of the vault. And then maybe they practice some, and then they go to the actual place, and it doesn't work out like they planned. But in smart contract attacking, it's not like that. An attacker can not only get the exact plans of your contract just by looking on Etherscan, they can have a complete practice environment by typing a single command, fork copy of mainnet where they can work on your stuff without you seeing it. They can see every single transaction that's gone through your system and what everything in your system did. When they're practicing attacking you, they get to see kind of every defense and try and attack every defense in their system. And then once they've perfected it down to a run that will work, they can just execute it. And all that happens in a single transaction, and boom, money's gone. This allows even for crazier attacks like the second cream, or one of the last cream attack, where the attacker actually borrowed and gave away $16 million, but literally gave away $16 million as part of their attack. And yet they were able to be so confident that this attack is going to work successfully that they're able to do something like that. So defending smart contracts is one of the hardest jobs in the world, hardest programming task in the world. But if you're learning from attackers, you have superpowers, because you get to essentially walk through every single step that the attacker made, down to every single bytecode instruction that got executed if you feel like it. You get to look at the perfect map of the victim contract, the perfect map of the attacker contract, and see every step that happened. So there's nothing like it for learning from an exploit. You don't have to just read about it. You don't just have to look at an exploit and kind of guess what happens. You can perfectly step through an attack. It's amazing. All right. So who am I? I am a senior engineer at Origin Protocol. We have a DeFi product with about $200 million in it. We also do NFT sales. We're also hiring. We've been around since the ICO craze and are still building. I personally grew up starting out on websites, just building websites, and then moved on to embedded software, some industrial programming, lights, like $1,000 lights, a lot of power supply coding, and then into blockchain, smart contracts, and eventually into blockchain security. For the past year, I've followed and dug into every single DeFi hack that has happened that has a reasonable amount stolen. My personal threshold is $1 million, although usually if I hear about it, I'll check it out otherwise. That's really me. Let's go into an attack. So when you're looking at an attack, there's 4 things you can look at, and you can focus on them or look at them in any way you want to. You've got the execution flow of what code executed, what contract called what contract with what parameters. You have the attack contract, which is almost always in bytecode and isn't easy to read. And then you have the victim contract, which would be easy to read, except for the fact that it's usually a half dozen contracts or more. And then you have the flow of funds. And you can start at any one of these points. So where do you start? Well, for one thing, I'm making this diagram look much simpler than it really is, because this is the reality. Is you've also got flash loans going on, you've got AMMs, you've got some kind of random contract that the attacker is talking to, you may have WETH, Oracle manipulation, maybe there's some proxy contracts involved, more than one victim contract. The victim contract may be sending off to other strategies, but really you can pretty much boil it down to you're trying to look at these things and just focus on that. So when there's an attack, there's almost always the same pattern that goes into an attack. First, the attacker prepares some funds. They may get a flash loan from somewhere. In some contracts, you can kind of skip this step because they're able just to get money. But most DeFi attacks start with the attacker getting some funds into position somehow. Then the attacker puts the victim contract into a bad state, or it twists the world around in some way that the victim contract is going to get messed up. This can be as simple as a single transaction. This can be as complicated as manipulating a whole lot of different things. And then the attacker tries to get money from that bad state that they put the contract into. And then lastly, the attacker may need to repay flash loans and then transfer the stolen funds out. Sometimes they'll sell them as well. So all that goes into it. But what you really want to focus on, jumping back here to this diagram, is you want to focus on the bug, finding what the bug is in the victim contract that allowed all this to happen. So rather than continuing to talk about this from a theoretical point of view, let's walk through an attack that happened yesterday, about 24 hours ago. And so we'll step through actually how we would solve on this attack here. So I'm pulling up Etherscan. We can see that somebody swapped some RIMCO tokens on Etherscan. We can see that there was about 1.2 Etherscan transferred here. This is kind of tokens transferred. And if you look kind of carefully at this, the only real takeaway you might have from this page is that somebody swapped a very big number of RIMCO tokens. So how do we go from this, just looking on Etherscan, into finding out what the hack was, what the vulnerability was? My favorite tool is ETHTX. So I'm going to go ethtx.info and paste in this transaction. And it'll take it a second to trace it through. Up here is events that were emitted in the transaction. We can just see that there's some token transfers here. This is one of my second favorite features here, is that this shows you at the end of this transaction what balance has changed. And so looking at this, I can see that the attacker spent 0.6 ETH, and at the end of the day, this address gained 1.2 ETH. And I can see that these two Uniswap pairs lost a small amount of ETH each. And so it looks like the attack ended up by stealing from Uniswap pairs, and the attacker ended up with a small profit. So here is the execution trace. This is what I love about ETX the most, is that you can see all the calls that one contract made to another contract, and you can see what it is, or you can see what values they return and what was passed to them. So here we can see this is the attacker address sent to this proxy. Now I happen to know that this attack was actually front run. So this is kind of a generic proxy that allowed this MEV bot to execute all the commands that the attacker was actually trying to attack or trying to run. So the first thing it does is does a balance of WETH to find out how much WETH is here. This is almost certainly just for the attacker or the front runners to find out if they've lost money or gained money on this transaction. And so here comes a call into an actual contract. This may be into the attack contract itself. I'm not sure. We can see that the RIMCO token had a burn called on it. We can see that RIMCO token was transferred to Uniswap. We see a swap right here that looks normal, transfers out a bunch of ETH, or a tiny bit of ETH. And then we can see another transfer to Uniswap, another swap, and then basically collecting the money. So if we're going to focus down on this, we can ignore all this, and we can ignore all this. And once we look a little bit closer, we realize, this attacker is stealing, or is basically transferring a crazy amount of money to Uniswap that they didn't start out with. So if this is more the step 3, the collect the funds part of the attack. And so that pretty much leaves us with this burn function here. Somehow this burn function got the attacker a whole lot of money. So now let's go in and take a look at the victim contract here. From here, I can just click on the token, go right to the contract, and look at the code. Now we saw that the burn function was suspicious. And so now we look at this thing, and now we put on our regular hat of how did burning one token result in the attacker having tons of tokens. And so we step in here into this first method. We know that count was called with a 1. We see it subtracting a 1. And Solidity, up until the most recent versions, would underflow if you did a subtraction. So what's happening here is the balance of the sender is set to 0. When a 1 is subtracted, it basically turns into infinity. And that infinity then is used to, well, at that point, the attacker has all the tokens and can just transfer it to wherever they want. So this line right here is the bug. That's why this one was an easy one to understand. When it came in, it took like 60 seconds to go through those steps to see this bug. Not everything is that easy. Some can be like an hour or more, or 2 hours, or a whole team of people figuring out what happened. But that's one easy one. So let's go right here. One thing that is really helpful to do as you're working through this is to have a text file and stick notes into it. Copy and paste your notes in, just in there. Take every transaction hash you're looking into, write contract addresses down that are getting called, and if you know the attacker's contract address. I tend to start with a very quick look at the money to see who gained, who lost, and then the main thing for me is looking at the execution flow. Cut out the stuff that's not useful to you. Attacks often spend a lot of their transactions, maybe even the majority of their transactions, on things that are not actually the vulnerability. Find where things go weird. Usually that's where the vulnerability is opened, and then find the bug in the victim contract. So that's kind of the standard way of working through a bug. So now I've labeled this one medium. It is actually not medium. Well, it's way harder than the other one, less hard than many. So we'll go take a look at this transaction here for a second. I keep doing this. I'll stop eventually. We'll go over to ETH again. Now this one we can see that there are a lot more events going on. If we look at the balances, we can see that this transaction ended up netting the sender about 45 WETH. And ended up netting the attacking contract about 145 WETH, minus the 42 ETH that it spent. But anyway, this was actually a part of a whole bunch of these transactions were looped and sent over and over again. So the attacker actually made off with maybe $30 million out of all of these. But in looking at this to see who the winner is, the attacker is clearly a winner. Who the loser is, this CR ETH contract, is a loser, as well as whatever this contract is quite a loser. So let's go down and look into the execution trace. And again, instead of being simple like the last one, this one's kind of complicated. Again, we're going to work on narrowing our way down. We see that there's a flash loan that comes in right here with this swap. And then this receiver right here, this is where it's coming into the flash loan. So we can kind of skip everything above that as being kind of irrelevant to finding out where things go weird. The attacker approves WETH, withdraws some WETH into ETH, mints some compound ETH here. And we can see that step through. So they basically lend 500 ETH to compound. Then they borrow AMP from compound. And then let's see what happens now. They create some kind of new contract. They move the money around to the new contract. They move the AMP that they borrowed around. Then from the new contract, they borrow more AMP. Oh, they transferred the, oh no, they liquidate it. And then they redeem ETH. And somehow in this process, they came out with 542 instead of what they put in, instead of 500. So somewhere in this, they made a profit. So somewhere in all this is something weird is happening. Now, this took me a while to figure out last time, or actually other people figured it out first. But if we look here, when this transfer happens, it's actually calling the attacker contract. Right here is a call back to the attacker contract during this AMP transfer. And so if we open this up to see what happens, we see that there's actually a borrow happening inside this borrow. There's a double borrow going on. So this appears to be a reentrancy bug. If I actually click on this right now, I'll be seeing the correctly patched version of this function. So it's not going to be super useful. So I have to say what happened after looking at this. So this attack was a reentrancy bug attack on a borrow. The problem was that the compound contracts, which these cream contracts were based off of, did the way the borrow function was written was vulnerable to a reentrancy bug, and was classically vulnerable to reentrancy bug. However, the overall contract was protected by a reentrancy guard that would prevent you from calling the same contract twice from inside itself. The way the attackers worked around this is they actually, the reentrancy guard was per compound contract or cream contract, and here they're on the AMP contract and they start a borrow, and then in re-entering they start a borrow onto the ETH contract. And so both contracts reentrancy guards are working, and yet they were still able to re-enter the system as a whole. So that was kind of the takeaway from learning from that. I'm just going to leave it there on this attack, but that's kind of how I worked through finding it or reading up on it afterwards. So bugs in smart contracts usually have one of three causes. The first is the contract writer did something stupid. Sometimes this is as simple as leaving off an authentication check, and so that anybody can set themselves as the governor, or writing your authentication check badly. Kind of the second one is a typical common vulnerability. Now this last one was a really advanced use of a typical common reentrancy vulnerability, but the patterns are kind of there. It's kind of easy to spot. The most common reason you get is for big hacks is that the universe is way more complicated than everyone thought. And this hack is also about half this way because the contracts had reentrancy protection, and yet by calling multiple contracts, the reentrancy protection could be bypassed, could be completely working successfully, but fail to protect. So a lot of hacks end up being complicated. And just because the attack is complicated, oftentimes reading up on it takes a lot of deductive and just figuring. A hard attack. Now, I'm not actually going to walk through one of these, but in the last month or two, some contracts have been saved before the attacker even had time to run their code. The attacker deployed their contract to run the attack. People were able to decode the attack, figure out what the plan was without any transactions running, but by just looking at the attacker contract, and then save the funds before the attack could actually execute. That's much harder because you don't have this execution trace anymore. And I'm not actually going to go walk through figuring that out right now. If you want to simulate it, you can take any attack that actually happened and make yourself not look at the transaction traces, not look at the flow of money, and disassemble and work your way through the attack contract to find out what it was doing to get into the victim contract. All right, that is pretty much the end, but I was going to let people ask questions and, yeah, see if anybody has questions here.
Oh yes, yeah. So we have couple of questions, and wow, like yeah, we have seen like your approach, basically like how you actually rip apart a bug, we can say, right? So that was very insightful, and going over all those ETX transactions and decoding all the stuff, right? So yep, so that was pretty much it. And yes, we have a couple of questions. One from Muhammad. He's asking like, you said that that contract is written in bytecode. So how do you write a whole contract in bytecode?
The attack contract, well, the reason why you're working from bytecode is because the attacker does not actually verify the contract on Etherscan. And so that's why you're working from the bytecode. It's not actually written in bytecode. It's the attack contracts are almost always still written in Solidity. But the only thing you have access to is the bytecode. You can get a sort of decompile of it on Etherscan, but if you search for Solidity decompilers, there's a couple websites you can paste in the contract address, and it will give you something that's a little bit more readable. That's kind of the answer to that question. On the Rimco token attack, there's not a public postmortem. I think the project appears to be pretty dead. I've contacted them. And yesterday morning and haven't heard anything back from them. So the post-mortem is pretty much my Twitter post at Daniel VF on Twitter.
Yeah, I actually have seen that that
Yes.
the you in the 112 I remembered from the post. All right. So yeah, it was pretty amazing, and yes, going from easy, medium, and hard ones, right? So yeah, we'll still be waiting for like decoding some hard bugs, like in maybe in future events. But yes, that was great. So yes, people are kind of appreciating the talk, and thanks for joining.
Thank you.
And yes,
Awesome. Well,
right.
I just kind of end by saying, these things that look extremely hard in the end almost always boil down to
Mhm,
something extremely simple. And so that's what I always try to do is find out after the giant pages of things that happened, what's the simple thing that went wrong, because
mhm.
that's the learning I carry into writing smart contracts, and that's the learning I carry away into looking for future bugs.
Right.
Even though big attacks often are very complicated, there almost always there's a couple small one or a couple small vulnerabilities. So your takeaway
Mhm,
coming away from analyzing a contract is what was the little vulnerability inside all of that.
mhm.
Um, to answer the question about any
Right.
answers to reentrancy guards being bypassed, there's kind of three different approaches there. One is be very careful which contracts you trust and only work from a whitelist. That's why Compound did not get hacked, is because they did not have any tokens that could call another token in the middle of a transfer, whereas Cream approved a token that could be whitelisted a token that could be used for a reentrancy attack. Secondly, in a case like this where you've got multiple contracts working, you can have a single master contract that prevents any kind of reentrancy attack from, or provides you a single global lock across all the contracts. So instead of you setting a value on your own contract when you start work, you set a value, you call this global lock and say, hey, lock everything, and now I'm done once you're done. Also, you can write your functions, individual functions, so they're not reentrancy vulnerable, which is what Compound and Cream ended up doing, is just moving that transfer down to the very end of the borrow function instead of in the middle. And that's was enough to solve it there.
Right, great. And I actually wanted to know, like, what are the top three bugs that you would recommend a guy like who's pretty new into the DeFi security space and wanted to learn some attack vectors. So, what are the three most, you can say, widely exploited bugs that you would recommend someone to learn, or like we see on a regular basis?
Mm-hmm. I'd say the three most common vulnerabilities in DeFi world are Oracle manipulation, where you think you're getting a price for something and while your transaction's running or around your transaction, somebody runs in there and changes the price so that you think that something's cheap's expensive or something's expensive is cheap and then runs the wrong thing. That's not so much a direct smart contract vulnerability, although it is, but it's not something that's written right there in the code. So that's probably the most common DeFi vulnerability. Reentrancy bugs are the classic Solidity vulnerability. That was the very first big hack, was a reentrancy bug. It's something that really can just trip you up because it's not something you expect. It's not something that's visible from the code. And then lastly would just be making a stupid mistake. It's so easy to just forget a line, you don't unit test, or you do unit test the success path, and of course it works for the success, but it fails otherwise. So, if you have a function that should require authentication, write a unit test that tries to call that function as an unauthenticated user and see if it fails and blows up. Because then if it dies, then it's just good. You have to be able to test the failure path as well, I guess. Any tips for understanding math-heavy contracts? I don't really, if you're talking about math-heavy contracts, the first thing that would come to my mind would be Curve, which if you look at the like Curve 3-pool source code or something, it goes deep math fast. For that, the simplest way for me to understand something like that and to see the behaviors is to use some kind of fork thing and send different transaction amounts to it. Like go take in your fork, take $400 million or $1 billion from one of Binance's accounts, transfer it through Curve, and see what happens out the other end. Maybe do that at several different amounts and make a little chart of what actually happens when that happens. Because speaking of Curve 3-pool, it's not intuitive how it actually behaves. But as far as understanding the math, I don't have any real solutions to actually understanding the math. Older versions of Solidity had a bug where you could do underflows like we just saw in that easy one. Fortunately, anything Solidity 8 and above now by default is safe when it's doing math instead of might wrap around.
Right,
But
right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, please go ahead. Sorry for interrupting.
okay. For Solidity versions less than 8, anytime you see a plus sign, a minus sign, a multiply sign, or a divide sign, you can be really concerned because those are unsafe in previous versions of Solidity.
Right, right. That is absolutely true. And yeah, so I would also recommend just going deep down into the maths of, let's say, Uniswap, right? The curve we have, the different curve, like the curve that they follows, that's multiplied by y equal to k, all the product mathematical formulas that we have on the basis of which you get actual reserve price, and also just deep down into that. And yes, somebody has asked like a strong knowledge of maths is required for blockchain security.
I don't think it's required at all. It's very rarely a math problem. And the things that are even half math end up being fairly common vulnerabilities. Really all you had to know is if I trade a whole bunch of this coin, it makes the price move up or it makes the price move down. And then you figure out what effect that has on the contract. Almost all the bugs are not, or I don't think I've seen a single contract attack that really required a deep understanding. I'll take that back. I've only seen one smart contract attack that required a more than surface level understanding of prices, just that prices change when you sell. Everything else, so much of DeFi hacks are things that have been seen before. So as you go through this over if you go through every hack that happens over a 3-month period, you've probably seen 95% of the vulnerabilities that take place. It's very rare that an attack actually comes in with a completely new vulnerability.
Correct, that's correct. And one more thing that I actually wanted to ask, we discussed that at the very start of our event, right? The notion of security, right? The notion of security which was there, like if we talk about back in 2018, right? And the notion of security right now, we are seeing like a lot of hacks, like literally occurring every other day. We are seeing lots of bounties as well coming out, and people are like, protocols are actually interested, even they are live already running and serving users, still they wanted to make sure that there should not be any undiscovered bugs. So according to you, how do you take it, and according to you, what is the notion of security right now?
I think that smart contracts are more secure than they have ever been. However, given that there's more of them, there's still, I think, more bugs than there have been. Um, One thing that we see in blockchain security is that an attacker will figure out kind of a new angle onto attacking contracts. And then that kind of contract all over the ecosystem will get hit from many different attackers um, for similar styles of bugs. And so for a while, there were classic attacks on big name DeFi protocols. We're just coming out of, or maybe we're still in, a period of attack on bridge contracts. This is one of the really big reasons for, if you follow the hacks as they happen, if you're trying to secure contracts, then that gives you the leg up on what's in style, and when a new vulnerability comes along, you can make sure that your contracts are secure. So that's why I do that. Secondly, if you're working from a bounty point of view, if a whole new style of attack starts happening, then you're also up with what's currently coming into style. Give me just a second. Think on the rest of your question. I think the bounties are really economically right. So much money is being stolen right now that even paying even bigger bounties than we're currently seeing still makes sense. Is still quite the profit for the protocols. Over time, eventually, hopefully, there'll be enough. Maybe we'll see fewer attacks and more white hats, which would be even if bounties are paying out $50 million in bounties a year or $100 million in bounties a year, that'd be a tremendous profit over what we're currently seeing on the attack side.
Right. So I think we can say it's directly proportional to the total value logged, right, in the DeFi ecosystem. Yes. The more funds we will be having, and the more number of amounts of white hats, and yeah, the number of attackers we'll be having in the space as well. So Jean has asking like how to apply for blockchain security engineer position. So like.
Um,
Mhm.
well, if you found a critical bug in a contract and got your name up on it, that probably would throw you right to the critical, or to the front of the line. One of the great things about bounty hunting side is that nobody has to give you permission to do this. Granted, nobody pays you until you find something, but if you're interested in getting started in it, that's a wonderful thing. It's completely permissionless, trustless. Use Immunify or something, so that they work on your behalf to get you paid afterwards. But that's how I would start if I were new to the field. Um, Otherwise, if you are already trained in security, or already know auditing or security stuff, then you might want to work at an auditor place. There is way less good guys in this ecosystem right now than there needs to be, and so the pay is high and people are desperate for people. So it's a great time to get in.
Right, absolutely true. And just hoping for a more number of white hats joining us and leading us, at least the white hat side, because we are seeing like new attacks on a daily basis, and it makes our job a little bit difficult because we have to explore what has actually happened in that attack and what was the vector, because as a security auditor we have to replicate that the same strategy on to our next audit and to find out whether it is there or not. Yes. So, like, if we have more and more people with us, we'll be securing more projects. So with that, I would just want to say thank you, Daniel, for being a part of UnChained and for sharing your valuable insights, your approach. Basically, I actually have got a DM from our own internal team, and he wanted to actually know what is your approach, basically how you uh, go ahead and approach a attack that has happened, approach a bug that has occurred. So yep, you have already shared that with us. So yep, with that, thank you so much, and it was a wonderful session. And hoping to see you soon, probably in another event. And keep rocking. Yeah, congrats,
Thank you
hacker.
so much. It was great to
Yes.
be here, and thank you.
Right.
You have a great one.
Yeah. Have a great day. Bye bye, Daniel.
Bye.
See you soon.